Have you ever felt like disappearing, like stepping quietly away from the world stage, not in defeat, but in longing? If so, tonight's story may speak to your heart. Thank you for joining me here, in this quiet corner of history. Welcome to Calm History for Sleep. If you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, I gently invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the city and time you're listening from. Let's travel back in time together. Whispers of the Nile echoed softly as a young Cleopatra stood barefoot on the warm banks of the river. Before she was a queen, she was a curious child watching reeds sway, her fingers trailing the water as if trying to read the river's secrets. The Nile, constant and ancient, hummed lullabies only she seemed to understand. Behind the towering walls of Alexandria, the palace whispered its own truths. Life there was gold and marble, but also heavy with expectations. Cleopatra, though wrapped in silk, often felt the stiff collar of duty pressing against her neck. The corridors echoed with footsteps that never paused, voices that always demanded. She wore the crown, yes, but it sat like iron on her brow. Amid the opulence, solitude wrapped itself around her. She smiled when needed, bowed when expected, but inside, she wondered if anyone truly saw the girl who once listened to the Nile's whispers. In the heart of the palace were silent gardens, hidden patches of green where time slowed. Here, the queen would lose her sandals and walk the damp earth, letting the scent of mint and basil carry her elsewhere. In these moments, she wasn't Cleopatra the queen. She was simply a woman seeking stillness. Letters never sent filled drawers in her chamber. Pages stained with ink and longing, meant for no one. Words of confusion, love and rebellion. Dreams scribbled in Greek and Egyptian, confessions folded away like messages placed in bottles and cast into an unseen sea. Each dawn came softly. Cleopatra awoke not to servants' calls, but to the hush before sunrise. In those private moments, she lit her own incense, brushed her hair slowly, and gazed into a mirror that did not judge. It was a ritual, a quiet reclaiming of self before the world took over. She mastered the art of disguise, not just with garments and accents, but with smiles that shielded sorrow. At night, she slipped unnoticed through side passages, cloaked like a shadow. Sometimes she sat among common folk, listening to their songs, tasting their food, yearning for their freedom. Music was her balm. Harps, flutes, and the soft rhythm of drums drifted through her private chambers. She'd close her eyes and breathe with the melodies. Songs carried her away from politics and poisons, from betrayal and bargaining, back to something pure. The great library of Alexandria held more than scrolls. It held memories. Late at night, she wandered its corridors, fingertips brushing spines, seeking not knowledge but comfort. History's voices whispered to her. She wasn't alone. Others had felt this longing too. Beneath starlit nights, she stood on balconies wrapped in linen, gazing out at the desert sky. The stars, steady and unbothered, gave her permission to dream. Sometimes she imagined she was one of them, burning quietly, seen only by those who looked closely. The scent of jasmine drifted through the palace. It reminded her of her mother's embrace, long gone. It clung to her robes and lingered in her hair. With each breeze, the past returned, soft and fragrant. She trusted few, but one stood by her, always a hidden confidant. This friend spoke little, but saw much. With them, Cleopatra dropped the mask. They shared figs, silence, and memories. With them, she laughed like the girl by the Nile, In court, veils and whispers spoke volumes. Cleopatra read gestures like texts, learned to respond without words. Power was delicate here. A glance could build or destroy. Yet in silence, she sometimes found more honesty than speeches ever held. Amid chaos, she carved out moments of stillness. A warm bath, a single date eaten slowly, a poem recited under her breath. These were her rebellions, her refuges. A painter once came, capturing her not as a ruler, but as a woman in thought. The portrait stayed hidden, but she returned to it often. It showed a softness no statue dared reveal. Her private garden bloomed with flowers no one else touched. She tended them herself. In their petals, she saw reflections of her own spirit, vibrant, resilient, unseen. Along the ancient shore, her footsteps faded quickly in the sand. She liked it that way, disappearing without trace. Just the sound of water and the wind's gentle song. Her journals held what no scribe could write. Feelings not fit for annals or archives. Pages of solitude, inked with hopes she barely admitted to herself. Even the taste of honey, rich and slow, felt like rebellion. A reminder that she could still savor life outside royal edicts and endless negotiations. At times, her dreams carried her beyond Egypt. She saw endless dunes, untouched and vast. In sleep, she walked them barefoot. No title, no crown, only the wind at her side. Before battles, there was calm. She sat in her chamber, wrapping herbs in cloth, braiding her hair, preparing not just for strategy but for survival of soul. Childhood memories echoed in her laughter, climbing fig trees, splashing in the river. The innocence she kept hidden, like a rare jewel only she could see. Some days, rebellion meant doing nothing at all, sitting beneath a fig tree, wearing no makeup, refusing to speak when silence served her better. One night, she wrote a letter to herself, words of hope. She sealed it with wax and hid it in a drawer. A reminder, you are more than they say. You are allowed to feel. At midnight, she often returned to her thoughts, not to plan or worry, but to reflect. The moon listened. It asked for nothing. It understood. The river still sang. Its song matured with her, shifting tones. But it always welcomed her back, whispering of who she once was. Letting go was an art. She practiced it slowly, releasing expectations, surrendering grudges. Sometimes she imagined vanishing into the crowd, just another face in the marketplace. At the end, she watched one last sunset. The colors spilled like wine across the sky. She closed her eyes, not in fear, but in reverence. And when she was gone, only whispers remained. Stories half told, glances remembered. A legacy not of conquests, but of quiet truths. Perhaps in her silence, she found peace. Beyond the throne, beyond the myths, there was a woman who wanted simply to be. The soft ripples of the Nile still lingered in Cleopatra's thoughts as she stepped beyond the riverbanks and into the heart of Alexandria. Gone were the reeds and the gentle hush of water. In their place stood the tall, ornate gates of the palace guards at attention, walls of polished stone and corridors lined with mosaics and marble. This was no longer the realm of whispers. This was the realm of eyes, always watching. She crossed the threshold and felt the temperature shift. The palace air was cool and perfumed, but beneath the fragrance lay something sharp expectation. The halls echoed with sandals on stone, servants' hurried steps, and the distant, formal laughter of court. The silence of the Nile had been replaced with a choreography of power. Even as a child, Cleopatra had known that life within these walls required a different self. The girl who had played in the river became a shadow here, still observant, careful. She learned early that to survive in the palace was to understand that truth was never spoken aloud. It lived between words, behind gestures, hidden in silence. She grew among columns that stretched to the sky, beneath frescoes of gods and legends. Her tutors taught her Greek and Egyptian, astronomy and mathematics, history and diplomacy. But more than that, she learned how to listen when no one was speaking, how to watch people's eyes more than their lips, how to smile without giving anything away. The palace was grand, yes. Golden lions stood at the entrances. Pools mirrored the sky in their surfaces. But grandeur could not protect from loneliness. At night, her chamber was silent too silent. She often lay awake, staring at the ceiling painted with constellations, wondering if the stars outside the city glowed more kindly. Meals were long, ceremonial affairs. Silver platters, delicate figs, wine in crystal cups. Yet Cleopatra often found herself tasting nothing. She played her part, answered with poise, laughed when expected. But within her, a quiet ache formed, the ache of being seen by everyone and known by no one. Behind the mask of royalty, she watched her father, Ptolemy XII, navigate politics like a man dancing over snakes. His smile was quick, his temper quicker. Cleopatra loved him, feared him, and pitied him all at once. From him, she learned that a crown did not protect one from the tremble of uncertainty. Her siblings were not companions, but rivals. In Alexandria's palace, even playtime was a battlefield. Cleopatra learned to hold her tongue, sharpen her mind, and guard her heart. She hid her vulnerabilities like a secret garden, tending to them only when alone. There were moments small, fleeting, when joy broke through the facade. A servant's kind smile, a bird nesting outside her window, the rustle of papyrus as she wrote her thoughts late into the night. These were her treasures, quiet things, unseen. She often stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the bustling city below. Alexandria teemed with merchants, scholars, sailors, and storytellers. She envied their freedom, their ability to disappear into a crowd, to walk without protocol, to laugh without consequence. Yet she also felt a responsibility growing within her. The city needed more than spectacle. Egypt needed more than ceremony. As she watched the sun dip into the Mediterranean, Cleopatra vowed not aloud, but within that she would one day be more than just a figure on a coin. In the evenings, she practiced the harp, her fingers nimble on the strings. Music was her escape, her confession, her quiet rebellion. She played not for others, but for herself. And in those notes, she felt something stir, a power not granted, but earned. The palace mirrors told her she was beautiful. Courtiers flattered her. Poets praised her intellect. But Cleopatra saw beyond their words. She saw the fear in their eyes when she spoke boldly. She noticed how often her suggestions were ignored until repeated by men. She took note. She remembered. With each year, her understanding deepened. Power was not the marble floor beneath her sandals. It was not the crown in her chambers. It was the pause in a room when she entered. It was the silence after her words. It was the choice to withhold or to reveal. Still, the mask never left her face completely. It was too dangerous. Too early. She wore it not out of deceit, but necessity. Behind it, she prepared. She read. She listened. She waited. The day would come when she could step beyond the palace walls, not as a girl in disguise, but as a ruler in truth. Until then, she moved like the moon, quiet, watchful, growing. In the quiet hours of the night, after the fires dimmed and the laughter faded, Cleopatra sat by her window, writing in the flicker of lamplight. Her scrolls were filled not with politics or plans, but with dreams of sailing to unknown lands, of walking barefoot again, of being remembered not just as a queen, but as a woman who truly lived. The palace, with all its masks and marble, could not contain her spirit forever. And somewhere, deep within its walls, a fire began to glow, not loud, not wild, but steady. It would grow, and the world would feel its warmth. A day came not with fanfare, but with quiet inevitability. Cleopatra stood before the tall mirror in her chamber, the soft morning light brushing against her features. Servants moved silently around her, adjusting robes, arranging hair, setting out jewels. But the crown, gleaming and ornate, sat untouched on a silk cushion. She stared at it for a long moment, as if expecting it to speak. She was no longer just a daughter of the Nile, or a shadow in the palace. She was queen. The title wrapped around her like embroidered linen, beautiful, heavy, and impossible to remove. The coronation had ended hours before. Applause echoed in her ears, the scent of lotus still clinging to her skin. Gold had shone on every surface, from her headdress to the temple doors. Dignitaries from Greece, Rome, and the eastern lands had gathered to see her rise. But as the crowds dispersed, Cleopatra felt the weight settle not on her head, but in her chest. Ruling was not about thrones or parades. It was about solitude. She learned quickly that power isolates. The men who once smiled freely now chose their words with caution. Servants bowed deeper. Advisors praised more and said less. Even her siblings' glances shifted, no longer playful, but edged with something sharper. In the grand hall, she held court with grace, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. But behind the throne's carved lions, she often found her fingers curling into her palm, as if holding something invisible together. Late at night, the palace felt like a theater emptied after the play. Columns cast long shadows. Tapestries stirred in the breeze, whispering secrets. In those moments, Cleopatra would walk the corridors barefoot, each step echoing louder than the day's applause. She missed the dirt paths of the village where she once visited as a girl. She missed laughter that wasn't calculated. She missed being able to say, "I don't know," without consequence. The world now expected her to know everything. Each decision she made shaped, more than policy, it shaped perception. She weighed alliances like a weaver handles thread. One wrong move, and the entire tapestry could unravel. Rome watched. Her people watched. Her enemies waited. She trusted few, but she trusted herself. And that trust, fragile as it was, had to be enough. The weight of the crown was not in its metal or gemstones. It was in the silence after the council meetings, when everyone else had left and only she remained. It was in the sealed letters to foreign rulers, each word a gamble. It was in the gaze of her people, searching her face for strength she sometimes didn't feel. She found solace in rituals. A cup of warm, spiced wine before dusk. A single candle lit beside a statue of Isis, the scent of myrrh rising in the air. These small acts were anchors, moments where she could breathe. In her private chamber, Cleopatra kept a chest of scrolls maps, poems, histories. She read not just to learn, but to escape. She traced the paths of ancient queens, wondering if they too felt this ache. Did they dream of disappearing for a day, a moment, a breath? But disappearing was not an option, not for her. She learned to speak many languages, not just to communicate, but to connect. With every dialect, she built bridges. With every treaty, she stitched wounds. But the one conversation she longed for, one without titles, without judgment, remained a dream. On the palace rooftop, where the noise of the court faded into wind, she stood beneath the stars. The sky did not care that she was queen. It offered no advice, no demands, just presence. And in that vast stillness, she felt both small and infinite. She wore the crown during ceremonies, but not always. In the privacy of her thoughts, she often imagined setting it down, just for a while, just long enough to remember what her voice sounded like without command in it. There were days she succeeded. A walk through the marketplace in disguise. A moment of laughter with a child who didn't know her name. A song hummed under her breath as she fed a temple dove. But mostly, she carried the crown not visibly, but inwardly. A constant reminder of what she had become, and what she could never return to. Still, Cleopatra did not resent the crown. She respected it. She had earned it, not through birthright alone, but through resilience, through learning how to lead without losing herself completely. That, perhaps, was the true challenge. Each morning, she returned to the mirror. The servants prepared her, the city awaited her, and the world kept turning. She lifted the crown herself, placed it on her head with steady hands, and she walked forward, not because she had no choice, but because somewhere, deep beneath the gold and solitude, she still believed she could shape something lasting, even if the world never truly knew the woman beneath the crown. Behind the grand facades and echoing marble of Alexandria's palace, hidden from the eyes of court and council, there lay a quiet sanctuary. It was not marked on maps nor spoken of in ceremonies. It was a garden, modest in size, but vast in meaning, a secret space Cleopatra claimed as her own. She discovered it as a girl, following the sound of birdsong through an unused corridor and past a weathered arch half covered in ivy. On the other side, time softened. The air smelled of mint, basil, and wildflowers. A fig tree spread its arms overhead, its shade cool and embracing. The walls, crumbling and vine-wrapped, offered privacy. Here, the queen was neither watched nor judged. As she grew, the garden grew with her. She had herbs planted: lavender, chamomile, coriander. A small pool was restored, where dragonflies danced. Every stone, every petal held her touch. Unlike the palace, where everything was curated for spectacle, the garden was real. It breathed with her. When the weight of the crown pressed too deeply, Cleopatra came here. She shed her golden sandals, walked barefoot on the earth, and let her royal posture dissolve. Sometimes she brought scrolls, other times only silence. Here, the stars above were not painted, but real. The moonlight dappled through leaves. Crickets sang. The world beyond the walls fell away. She spoke to no one of this place, not even her confidant. Not because she didn't trust, but because some sanctuaries cannot be shared without losing their magic. The garden was her conversation with the divine, her escape from the theater of power. There were moments she wept there, hidden by the fig tree's shadow, not out of weakness, but from the ache of holding everything together. The soil beneath her nails reminded her of her humanity, something the throne rarely allowed. At times, she brought offerings: a handful of dates, a carved shell, a folded note never read aloud. She left them beneath the fig tree as if in tribute to the unseen guardians of her peace. Seasons passed, and the garden changed. Flowers bloomed and withered. Trees thickened. Vines climbed higher. Cleopatra aged, but the garden never betrayed her. It accepted her in joy and sorrow alike. On days when the court brimmed with whispers and advisors circled like falcons, she would slip away to this refuge. She'd lie on the grass, arms outstretched, watching clouds drift above. She'd listen not to strategy or rumor, but to wind, water, wings. Here, she could be quiet. Here, she remembered who she was before the crown. The garden became a mirror, reflecting not her titles, but her truths. It reminded her that strength could be soft, that sovereignty could live in stillness, that even queens needed a place to simply be. She imagined once that after her reign, this space would remain. Perhaps another young girl, curious and seeking, would find it, and perhaps the garden would welcome her too, not as a ruler, but as a soul needing rest. And so Cleopatra returned to it, again and again, each visit a silent vow. No matter how high the walls of power rose, she would always have this piece of earth, this pocket of sky. It was not marked in the palace records, but it was the place where she remembered herself best. Behind the grand facades and echoing marble of Alexandria's palace, hidden from the eyes of court and council, there lay a quiet sanctuary. It was not marked on maps nor spoken of in ceremonies. It was a garden, modest in size, but vast in meaning, a secret space Cleopatra claimed as her own. She discovered it as a girl, following the sound of birdsong through an unused corridor and past a weathered arch half covered in ivy. On the other side, time softened. The air smelled of mint, basil, and wildflowers. A fig tree spread its arms overhead, its shade cool and embracing. The walls, crumbling and vine-wrapped, offered privacy. Here, the queen was neither watched nor judged. As she grew, the garden grew with her. She had herbs planted: lavender, chamomile, coriander. A small pool was restored, where dragonflies danced. Every stone, every petal held her touch. Unlike the palace, where everything was curated for spectacle, the garden was real. It breathed with her. When the weight of the crown pressed too deeply, Cleopatra came here. She shed her golden sandals, walked barefoot on the earth, and let her royal posture dissolve. Sometimes she brought scrolls, other times only silence. Here, the stars above were not painted, but real. The moonlight dappled through leaves. Crickets sang. The world beyond the walls fell away. She spoke to no one of this place, not even her confidant. Not because she didn't trust, but because some sanctuaries cannot be shared without losing their magic. The garden was her conversation with the divine, her escape from the theater of power. There were moments she wept there, hidden by the fig tree's shadow, not out of weakness, but from the ache of holding everything together. The soil beneath her nails reminded her of her humanity, something the throne rarely allowed. At times, she brought offerings: a handful of dates, a carved shell, a folded note never read aloud. She left them beneath the fig tree, as if in tribute to the unseen guardians of her peace. Seasons passed, and the garden changed. Flowers bloomed and withered. Trees thickened. Vines climbed higher. Cleopatra aged, But the garden never betrayed her. It accepted her in joy and sorrow alike. On days when the court brimmed with whispers and advisors circled like falcons, she would slip away to this refuge. She'd lie on the grass, arms outstretched, watching clouds drift above. She'd listen not to strategy or rumor, but to wind, water, wings. Here, she could be quiet. Here, she remembered who she was before the crown. The garden became a mirror, reflecting not her titles, but her truths. It reminded her that strength could be soft, that sovereignty could live in stillness, that even queens needed a place to simply be. She imagined once that after her reign, this space would remain. Perhaps another young girl, curious and seeking, would find it. And perhaps the garden would welcome her too, not as a ruler, but as a soul needing rest. And so Cleopatra returned to it, again and again, each visit a silent vow. No matter how high the walls of power rose, she would always have this piece of earth, this pocket of sky. It was not marked in the palace records, but it was the place where she remembered herself best. Before the city stirred, before the palace opened its doors to petitioners and politics, Cleopatra awoke to a softer world. The first light of dawn spilled gently through the lattice windows, casting patterns of gold and pearl across her chamber walls. It was the hour she cherished most, when she could still be herself. She rose without servants. Their help would come later, with ceremony and precision. But these first moments belonged to her alone. She moved quietly across the stone floor, the coolness beneath her feet grounding her. The scent of rose water from a shallow bowl welcomed her with familiarity. Her rituals were not for display. There were no courtiers watching, no scribes recording, only the hush of morning and the rhythm of her breath. She began with stillness, seated near the open window, facing east. The city lay below, rooftops soft with dew, smoke rising gently from bakeries not yet crowded. Birds sang in the distance. She closed her eyes and listened, not just with ears, but with presence. Breathing slowly, she let the worries of governance fall away, like petals drifting into water. In this space, Cleopatra did not plan. She did not calculate. She simply existed. A basin of warm water awaited her. She dipped a cloth into it and washed her face slowly, as if cleansing not just sleep, but expectations. Each motion a prayer of gratitude for breath, for strength, for another sunrise. She anointed her wrists with oils, jasmine, frankincense, myrrh, not for allure, but for comfort. These scents reminded her of gardens, temples, and sacred spaces. They grounded her when the day would try to lift her too far from herself. She brushed her hair slowly, feeling the strands slip between her fingers like threads of memory. In the silence, she sometimes hummed a melody her mother once sang, something wordless and ancient. Her breakfast was simple: figs, goat cheese, a sip of date wine. She ate by the window, watching the sky shift from lilac to rose. With each bite, she tasted the present moment. No strategy, no appearances, just nourishment. There were days when she read a poem before the world arrived, verses from Sappho or a scroll copied from the temple library. The words wrapped around her like silk, reminding her that others had also loved, feared, hoped. Sometimes she took out one of her letters never sent and read it quietly to herself. Not always the same one, just whichever called to her that morning. It was a way of checking in with her spirit, her longing, her truth. As the sun crept higher, The sounds of the palace returned. Footsteps in the hall. Voices preparing for another day of diplomacy and display. But Cleopatra did not rush. She folded her cloth, returned her oils, stood slowly, letting the light wrap around her like a shawl. In these mornings, she remembered who she was beneath the crown. A woman of ritual, a daughter of stillness, a soul tethered not just to a kingdom, but to something quieter and deeper. By the time her attendants entered ready to drape her in silks, arrange her hair, and place the weight of royalty upon her, Cleopatra was already prepared. Not because she had performed a role, but because she had remembered herself first, and that remembrance would carry her through whatever the day demanded. Not all queens enter rooms with trumpets. Sometimes they enter in silence, cloaked not in gold, but in shadows. Cleopatra, though born to dazzle, learned early the power of invisibility. When the world expects spectacle, there is strength in becoming unseen. In the corridors of the palace, she wore robes of silk and jewels of sun-kissed amber. But when dusk fell, and the court's attention drifted elsewhere, she slipped through hidden doors with a linen shawl pulled low, sandals worn thin from secret journeys. Alexandria was a city of corners and voices, of crowded streets and stories whispered over clay cups. And Cleopatra, in her plain dress and dyed veil, walked among her people not as ruler, but as one of them. She learned their names, their songs, the smell of their markets, and the rhythm of their fears. She saw how the tides of the Nile shaped lives far from marble halls. She listened to merchants speak of taxes, to mothers worry over grain, to sailors curse the wind. No bodyguards, no trumpets, just her breath and the cities. It was not always safe. Power invites risk. But Cleopatra trusted her instincts, her disguises, and the cloak of night. In shadow, she could observe without being observed, understand without being interpreted. Her favorite disguise was not a costume, but a posture, a way of walking that made others look past her. The tilt of her head, the lowered gaze, the soft tread. She became ordinary, and in becoming ordinary, she became free. Sometimes she laughed with strangers over street food, the taste of spiced chickpeas warming her tongue. Other nights, she lingered near the harbor, watching ships glide like quiet beasts into the dark. She did not always need to speak. Presence was enough. She carried a small pouch of coins, not to buy, but to give. To a child singing off-key for coin. To a widow with salt in her hair. These gifts were not royal decrees, but human offerings. Tiny acts of empathy beneath the veil of night. Back in the palace, her advisors spoke of public favor, of shaping image, of feeding legend. Cleopatra said little. She nodded, listened, noted the gap between their words and the truth she had seen firsthand. Disguise for her was not deception, it was revelation. In those moments of anonymity, she saw herself reflected in the ordinary lives she touched. Their strength echoed her own. Their struggles clarified her purpose. Power did not reside solely in titles. It lived in connection, in awareness, in the willingness to witness. She returned from these walks changed, not grandly, quietly, a softened brow. A new question to pose, a policy reconsidered. Leadership shaped not in marble chambers, but in muddy streets. Some nights, she wrote about what she saw. Brief lines tucked among her letters never sent. A boy laughed, though he had no shoes. I want to remember what that means. Or, they do not know their queen walked beside them, but I do. and I am better for it. Even centuries later, stories would tell of Cleopatra's disguises, slipping past Roman guards, meeting allies in secret, sailing hidden beneath the stars. But what history often misses is this: she did not disguise herself to hide. She did it to see more clearly, and sometimes to be seen not as a ruler, but as a woman who still walked the world with open eyes and an unarmored heart. In the hush that followed long days of counsel and command, Cleopatra often retreated to the one place where no words were required, her chamber of music. The room was modest by royal standards, nestled in the eastern wing where the sea breeze could slip in uninvited and play among the silken curtains. The walls were carved with soft reliefs of lyres, dancers, and winged goddesses whose eyes held laughter frozen in stone. Candles lined the niches. They did not blaze, they shimmered, casting a low golden aura that warmed without glare. In this sacred space, the queen did not speak. She listened. Strings hummed, reeds sighed, percussion echoed like distant heartbeats. Her court musicians knew to play not for grandeur, but for soul. There were no performances here, no applause, just music, soft and unspooling, filling the room like incense. Cleopatra's favorite instrument was the kinnor, a small, ancient harp cradled gently in the lap. When she played, her fingers moved not with the precision of a practiced performer, but with the intimacy of someone speaking through sound. Each note was a breath, each chord a confession. She had learned music as a child, sitting on cool marble floors, while elder women plucked melodies that spoke of sunrises and longing. Back then, it had been a game, but now it was necessity. A way to survive the weight of voices that never truly heard her. There were songs for different moods. For sorrow, slow, minor tones that sank like stones into the chest. For healing, melodies that rose gently, like birds testing morning air. For memory, ancient hymns her mother once sang, their words half forgotten, but their rhythms etched into bone. Some nights, when the palace was still, Cleopatra would gather only one or two trusted musicians. No court, no ceremony. Just them, the kinnor, a ney flute, perhaps a sistrum's rattle. They would sit on cushions strewn with woven patterns, a plate of pomegranates nearby, and play into the night. It was during these sessions that her mind wandered farthest. Music opened chambers in her soul that no council door ever could. In a single melody, she could revisit the riverbanks of childhood, or the fig tree of her secret garden. She could speak to ghosts without needing to name them. Sometimes she sang not loudly, not in the polished Greek of her court, but in the soft, old dialect of the Delta, the language of grandmothers and fishermen. Her voice was low and earthy, wrapped in silence like linen around a newborn. The songs held no ambition, only memory. To those present, it was not their queen who sang. It was a woman with eyes closed, voice trembling slightly, who happened to wear a crown when daylight returned. She kept a small box beneath the divan. Inside were pieces of broken instruments, an old reed pipe cracked down the middle, a bronze tuning fork dulled with age, a carved wooden pick worn smooth from use. She could not part with them. They were tokens not of failure, but of presence, of moments when she had found herself. There were visitors' envoys from distant lands, poets, musicians, thinkers who marveled at her intellect, her strategy, her poise. But few knew of her relationship with music. Fewer still understood that. It was music, not rhetoric, that kept her spirit intact. When Julius Caesar first arrived in Alexandria, he had asked about the acoustics of her halls. But it was only later, in a moment unguarded and quiet, that he heard her hum a lullaby while cradling a scroll. He said nothing then, only looked. Mark Antony once brought her a cithara from Rhodes, finely crafted and deep-toned. It was a gift of politics disguised as passion. Yet Cleopatra, ever astute, received it not as tribute, but as acknowledgment. He had glimpsed something true. Her music did not belong to any man, any alliance, any empire. It was hers, as personal as her breath, as essential as her dreams. It was not created for others. It was summoned from within. She once wrote in a letter never sent, "I do not know if the gods hear me, but I know music does, and that is enough." Even in war, she traveled with musicians, not for morale or show, but to preserve her rhythm, her pulse, her private tether to call. Between battles and meetings, she'd steal a moment to hear a song, to feel her shoulders drop, her breath return. In her final years, the music changed. It became slower, more spacious, not sad, contemplative. She sought not distraction, but clarity. The melodies were spare, sometimes only a few notes repeated, but in them she heard everything: victories, betrayals, laughter, grief, all braided into sound. On the last evening before the world would call her a myth, Cleopatra asked for one song. It was a tune no one else knew, one she had written herself, fragment by fragment over years. She hummed it to her kinnor, eyes closed, fingers trembling. The musicians watched in reverence, understanding that this was not performance. It was farewell. And when the final note dissolved into silence, Cleopatra opened her eyes, the candlelight dancing in her pupils. No tears, no fanfare, just a soft exhale, like the end of a verse. She set the kinnor down, stood, and disappeared into the folds of history, a song still echoing behind her. Not every queen needs a statue. Some need only a melody. And the memory of a soul who knew how to listen. Asterisk, asterisk. By day, Alexandria was a city of sunlight, and scaled its streets alive with voices. Markets scented by spices and salt air. Ships docking like giants from far-off lands. But by night, Cleopatra walked in quieter company. Her destination was not the throne room or the temple, but a sanctuary of a different kind. The great library. Not all who entered did so with reverence. To many, it was a place of prestige, a symbol of power, of learnedness, of Alexandria's reach. But to Cleopatra, it was far more personal. It was a refuge, a mirror, a whispering chorus of the past. She never came with attendants. The librarians had learned not to announce her, not to follow, not to speak unless spoken to. She would appear. As dusk settled, wrapped in a simple cloak, her footsteps soft against the stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of seekers. She knew its passages well. Each hallway lined with scrolls, the scent of parchment and cedar lingering like a memory. Light filtered in through high windows, flickering on motes of dust. Shelves soared to the ceiling, heavy with knowledge gathered from every shore. This was where the world kept its thoughts. And Cleopatra, more than a queen, was a listener. She sought not titles, but questions. What did the stars know that she did not? What secrets did the mathematicians whisper to the gods? What songs had been lost in the sands of Nubia, waiting to be found in ink? She wandered the aisles not with purpose, but with presence. Her fingers traced spines, her eyes scanned titles in tongues both familiar and foreign. Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Sanskrit, Phoenician. She loved them all. For in their letters, she felt less alone. She often sat in a high alcove tucked behind. A marble colonnade, a simple bench, a small oil lamp, a scroll in her lap. There, time dissolved. She read of queens who ruled through silence, of poets exiled for truth, of lovers who met beneath desert moons. She once wrote in a letter never sent, "Here in this library, I am not queen. I am a voice among voices, a flame among embers." There were texts that made her weep, odes to lost cities, chronicles of suffering, journals of wanderers who never returned. Others made her smile, a fable about a lion who feared mice, or a tale of a baker who fell in love with the moon. She met philosophers in the shadows, not in debate, but in dialogue. They shared theories not yet tested, dreams not yet confessed. And she listened not to rule, but to understand. Knowledge, she believed, was not accumulation. It was intimacy. The library held more than scrolls. It held silence. And in that silence, Cleopatra found clarity. Not all wisdom arrived in thunder. Some came in a single line, hidden on the fifth shelf of a forgotten corner. On her most troubled days, when alliances frayed, when Rome's breath grew too close, she came here. Not for escape, but for grounding. The library reminded her that she was not the first to carry burden, not the only one to question. She kept a private journal, written only in her own hand, filled with quotes and thoughts gathered under those stone arches. She titled it Whispers, and it rested beneath her pillow. There were rumors that Cleopatra memorized entire scrolls, that she could recite poems from languages she'd never spoken. These rumors were mostly true, not because she sought brilliance, but because she sought connection to ideas, to lives long gone. Once, a librarian asked her what she hoped to find. She smiled softly, eyes drifting upward. "A piece of myself," she said, "or at least a reflection." She sometimes left gifts behind: an extra candle, a flower, a scroll she had written herself. She never signed them. Let the words speak. When storms came and the city below shivered, she would press her palm to the cool stone of the library's wall, grounding herself not in royalty, but in remembrance. That all empires fall, that all rulers fade, but words remain. Got in the great library of Alexandria, Cleopatra found not certainty, but resonance. And that was enough. Not every queen needed armies. Some wielded curiosity and built kingdoms in the mind. Asterisk in the hush that settled after the city dimmed its torches and the palace closed its doors, Cleopatra found herself drawn upward to rooftops, balconies, and open courtyards, where the only canopy above her was the endless tapestry of night. The desert sky was unlike any other, vast, unpolluted, ancient. It pulsed with stars that felt older than history itself. They blinked slowly, like distant eyes keeping quiet watch. And beneath them, Cleopatra shed the day's weight. She came wrapped in shawls, a clay lamp in one hand and silence in the other. These nightly rituals were hers alone. No guards, no scribes, no courtly obligations. Just sky and soul. She would sit cross-legged on cushions laid atop the palace's highest terrace. A brazier nearby glowed gently, its smoke curling upward, as if trying to touch the heavens. The air was cooler here, tinged with the scent of sand, jasmine, and the far-off sea. Some nights she brought scrolls, star charts, mythologies, notes scribbled during her visits to the library. She traced constellations with her fingertip, whispering their names: Orion, Sirius, Scorpio, Sobek. She had memorized them not to navigate ships, but to navigate herself. The stars offered no answers. That was their beauty. They simply were constant, luminous, distant, yet intimate. Cleopatra did not come to them for prophecy, but for perspective. She would lie back, arms spread, breath slowed, and the sky would fill her vision completely. In those moments, she felt not small, but infinite, as if her heartbeat joined the pulse of something older than Egypt, older than gods. There was one star she always returned to, a faint one near, the horizon. She called it her mother's eye, not scientifically named, but emotionally known. Whenever she was afraid, she found it, and in its quiet shimmer, she felt held. She often thought of her ancestors, not just the Ptolemies or Macedonians, but the forgotten women farmers, healers, singers whose names were dust, but whose lives had meaning. Did they too gaze upward, wondering if the sky remembered them? One night she whispered, "May my soul rise like smoke and settle among you, not as queen, but as memory." She believed the stars heard, not in words, but in feeling. And that was enough. The terrace became her confessional, her place of reckoning, her chapel without walls. When the burdens of power grew heavy, she returned here. When love complicated her thoughts, she came. When fear coiled inside her, she found light above. There were times she brought musicians, but only rarely. A flute, a harp, played gently beside her as she watched the sky. The notes were spaced out, like constellations of sound. She preferred the silence between them. The stars reminded her of paradox, how something so distant could feel so close, how something so cold could bring such warmth, how she, a woman often called divine, could still feel entirely human beneath them. She once wrote in a scroll, "The stars do not ask for loyalty. They do not care who rules. They simply exist, and in their indifference, I find peace." When war was near, she still came. When alliances shifted, she still came. Even when grief took root and refused to loosen its grip, she still came. Because the stars did not change. And some nights, that was all she needed. She sometimes lit incense in shallow bowls, frankincense, cedar, a pinch of desert sage. The smoke would spiral upward, as if trying to leave a message among the constellations. Other nights, she would speak to the moon, not in prayer, but in companionship. "You watched me when I was a girl," she would whisper. "Watch me still." Time on the terrace did not follow palace hours. There were no bells, no schedules. Only her body's rhythm and the slow spinning of the cosmos. Sometimes she fell asleep there, wrapped in linen and dreams. Servants would find her at dawn, curled like a child, her face soft, the night still clinging gently to her skin. She never explained. They never asked, because even queens deserve to belong to the stars. And under that starlit canopy, Cleopatra was not legend. She was simply a soul looking upward, longing to understand where the light truly lived. The first time Cleopatra remembered the scent of jasmine, she was not yet queen. She was a girl, barefoot in the early morning, running through the palace's eastern colonnade. A breeze caught her hair, and with it came a sweetness so delicate. It made her stop mid-stride. It was a moment brief enough to be forgotten, yet it wasn't. That scent followed her all her life. Jasmine became memory incarnate. Years later, the same breeze would find her in the grand halls, perfumed by flowers, arranged for court rituals. But it was the natural jasmine, the kind that grew along cracked garden walls and twisted around forgotten pillars, that stirred something deeper. It smelled of before the crown, before Rome, before the weight of eyes and the theater, of power got in her private quarters. Cleopatra kept a small clay bowl of dried jasmine blossoms. She would crush a few between her fingers at night, inhaling slowly as if drawing breath from another life. The aroma lingered in her curls, on her linens, sometimes even between the pages of scrolls she reread in solitude. Her mother had worn jasmine oil. Cleopatra remembered the way her embrace carried that fragrance, how it would cling to her own tunic after a hug. When the world felt vast and unknowable, she'd pull that tunic close and breathe in comfort. After her mother's death, Cleopatra began planting jasmine vines in quiet corners of the palace. Not for anyone else, not for decoration, but for presence, for remembrance. She watched them climb toward the sun, tenacious and soft all at once. She often sat beside them during the hush of late afternoon, letting their scent wrap around her. Like a memory returned. In those hours, she did not need language. The jasmine spoke in feeling, in fragrance, in the language of nostalgia. During diplomatic visits, Cleopatra never wore the heavy perfumes favored by some of her contemporaries. She preferred a drop of jasmine oil at her wrists and behind her ears. Subtle, lasting, a whisper instead of a proclamation. Mark Antony once asked her, in a rare unguarded moment, why she always smelled of jasmine. She smiled, but did not answer. Some truths are too sacred for explanation. The scent became her talisman. In moments of crisis, she would light a dish of jasmine resin. The smoke curled upward, pale and steady. Even when her voice had to be strong, even when the court demanded fire, she carried jasmine in her breath, a hidden softness, a tether to something still untouched by politics. When she traveled, she took dried blossoms wrapped in linen. No matter the distance or the foreign tongue, one inhalation could bring her home. She once wrote, "If they remember anything of me, let it not be the gold or the silk or the battles won. Let them say, she smelled of jasmine, even in sorrow." The scent even found its way into her dreams. She walked through halls made of wind, through gardens suspended in air, and the only constant was the soft presence of jasmine on the breeze. It became her guide, her lullaby, her gentle ghost. There was a night when the winds shifted before a storm, and the air filled suddenly, overwhelmingly, with jasmine. Cleopatra stood on her terrace and closed her eyes. It was almost too much, as if the past had arrived all at once, pressing itself against her skin. She did not cry. Instead, she whispered, I remember everything." In the final days, as the palace darkened and the world pressed closer with demands and destiny, she asked her attendants to bring bowls of jasmine petals to her chambers. They filled the air until it was thick with memory. Those who entered said the room smelled like spring, like something eternal. And when Cleopatra was gone, the petals remained, dry, pale, fragrant, a reminder that presence is not always loud. That memory can be as soft as scent, and that some queens leave behind not monuments, but breezes, carried by jasmine, carried forever. Asterisk, even the most solitary of souls needs a witness. Amid the endless corridors, watchful eyes, and ceremonial masks of Alexandria's palace, there existed one bond that required no performance. A relationship outside of court structure and beyond the reach of politics. Cleopatra's confidant, her shadow, her mirror, her quiet anchor. His name never appeared in the scrolls of official history. He was not a senator, not a warrior, not a name chiseled in stone. He was a scribe once, in the early days of her adolescence, chosen to teach her calligraphy and the flow of hieroglyphs. He stayed far longer than his assignment. His presence became as constant as the Nile, never loud, never ornamental. He did not flatter her, nor shrink from her gaze. He listened, and in a world where everyone spoke at her, his silence became a rare and cherished gift. He was older by decades, with eyes that had seen empires shift like dunes in the wind. His voice, when it did come, was textured like papyrus, rich with patience. Cleopatra called him Madet, a quiet nod to balance and truth. They would meet not in the throne room, but in the small garden near the library, or in her music chamber, or while walking among the lemon trees near the edge of the palace grounds. Their conversations were not always deep. Often they were simply about the shape of clouds or the rhythm of footsteps on mosaic floors. But there was nothing simple about trust. He once told her, when she had failed to convince a foreign envoy to honor an alliance, even the moon does not shine in every sky. That does not make it lesser. She remembered that line for years. Madet never overstepped. He never advised unless asked, never lingered when dismissed. Yet Cleopatra found herself seeking his company more and more. In his presence, she was allowed to falter, to question, to exist outside of legacy. When her brother's supporters plotted in the dark, Madet knew before the whispers reached her ears. He said only, "Watch the birds. They flee before storms come." And they did. He brought her news from the docks, from the gardens, from the kitchens. But more than that, he brought her context, the human texture behind politics. He reminded her that power was not only held by those with titles. One evening, after a particularly grueling council meeting, she asked him, "Why do you stay when others come only for coin or gain?" He looked at her, not as a queen, but as a woman carrying too many unspoken things. "Because you still listen," he said. "And because somewhere in you, the river still runs." She did not need to ask what river. May single quotes at taught her that solitude does not mean isolation, that even in silence, connection could grow like vines between stones. He knew when to leave her alone, and when to place a warm fig in her hand without a word. They shared rituals, a cup of hibiscus tea at sunset, a single line of poetry recited while watching ships, a shared gaze during ceremonies, quiet affirmations passed without speech. He never sought credit. When dignitaries praised her wisdom, he simply nodded in the background. When war arrived and advisors argued in loud circles, he sat with her. After helping her make sense of the noise, their final conversation was short. A soft afternoon, golden with late light. Madet, older now, hands more frail. She offered him a cushion. He declined. "You do not need me anymore," he said. Cleopatra smiled. I always will. He left that evening, not with fanfare, not with ceremony, just a quiet bow and a whisper of jasmine in the air. She never saw him again, but long after, when she stood alone in chambers heavy with silence, she would feel a presence. Beside her unseen, but steady, not a ghost. A memory kept warm, the one who had witnessed her, not as ruler, but as soul. And that kind of witnessing, rare and sacred, does not fade. It roots itself deep. And remains. Asterisk. The throne room of Alexandria shimmered like a mirage, columns of alabaster, pools of still water, mosaics that told tales beneath one's feet. And yet, the true language of power in that place was not spoken aloud. It moved in glances, in the shift of a veil, in the space between two words. Cleopatra had learned this language before she wore the crown. As a girl, seated beside her father during diplomatic audiences, she watched how power was rarely declared. It was implied, carried in pauses, in controlled breath, in the way one held or released silence. The court was not a stage for truth. It was a ballet of restraint, and Cleopatra became its most skilled dancer. She understood that words, once spoken, could be used, but what remained unsaid could never be misquoted. So she mastered the pause, the half-smile, the sidelong glance that spoke volumes to those attuned. Her veils became tools, not mere ornaments. She wore them not just for fashion or modesty, but for strategy. A sheer blue veil for mourning a diplomat lost at sea. A veil of deep red when she needed to evoke passion or strength. A pale silver one, translucent like breath, when she wished to unsettle the Roman envoys who thought they could read her. Underneath them, her eyes told the story. Some days, her silence spoke of warning. Other days, it whispered intrigue. And, when necessary, it roared with defiance. The courtiers adapted. They became translators of her quiet. A tilt of the head could shift political alliances. The brush of her fingertips on a goblet could signal approval. Averted eyes could end a conversation. Began. In this world, secrets were not hidden. They were performed, and Cleopatra's court became a theater of whispers. She often held private audiences where nothing official was discussed, yet decisions were made. Conversations would begin with riddles and end with nods. Agreements forged, in suggestion rather than decree. Some diplomats found it maddening. Others were enchanted. All were aware they were playing her game. It was not manipulation for sport. It was survival. For a woman in a world of men, for an Egyptian in a Rome-dominated world, ambiguity was armor. And veils, whether of fabric or of silence, were her shield. There were times, however, when she wished she could speak plainly, to strip away the theater and speak from her core. But she had learned too well. Clarity could be dangerous in a court that devoured certainty. So she kept a balance. A glance to a loyal guard. A soft murmur to a trusted advisor. A fan folded and placed beside her right hand signals known only. To the inner circle. At night, away from the marble and masks, she wrote down what she couldn't say. In her letters never sent, she recorded the truths buried under veils. The feelings behind her public calm. The thoughts unvoiced while the world listened. "I have become fluent in silence," she once wrote. And in it, I sometimes forget the sound of my own truth. But then came moments of unexpected clarity. Like the day a foreign queen visited with no translator and spoke to her in ancient Egyptian. Their entire conversation lasted 10 minutes. No interpreters, no theater. Just two women, eyes unguarded. Language shared. Cleopatra remembered that exchange for the rest of her life, not for its content, but for its honesty. Still, the court awaited her every morning, and she returned to it with grace. Each entrance choreographed, each word measured. Her silence, honed into an instrument more powerful than any proclamation. And those who sought to understand her, truly understand her, would have to listen not to what she said, but to what she withheld. Because in Cleopatra's court, the most dangerous secrets were never spoken. They were felt. Veiled. Whispered. And always understood by those wise enough to hear without sound. Asterisk, there were days when Alexandria's palace roared like the sea waves of messengers, advisors, demands, and decisions breaking against Cleopatra from dawn until dusk. Yet even in the thickest storm, she carved out spaces of calm. Stillness was not a luxury. It was a necessity. In a life where every glance could be strategy, every word diplomacy, she discovered that stillness gave her strength that politics could not. These were not idle moments, nor escapes from duty. They were rituals of remembrance of the body, the breath, the spirit beneath the crown. Sometimes, the moment came in the warm embrace of a bath. Alone, in a chamber where rose petals floated on steaming water, Cleopatra would sink beneath the surface. The weight of the world washed away with every breath. There were no advisors in the steam, no Rome, no expectations. Just water and the whisper of herself. At other times, peace came in the form of flame. She would sit near a single candle, watching the way the light danced. It wasn't meditation in the modern sense, it was presence. A deep returning to the now, when past and future had no voice. She had a cushion placed in a particular corner of her garden shaded by fig leaves, warmed by late morning sun. There, she would sit with a clay cup of warm spiced wine and let the world continue without her for a while. Let it breathe. Let it wait. She often stroked the soft fur of the palace cats, letting her fingers sink into their warmth. The animals did not care for diplomacy. They did not see titles. They curled beside her, purred in her lap, and reminded her that affection could still be simple. One of her scrolls recorded this line: "In stillness, I do not vanish. I return." During festivals, when music rang loudly through the city and laughter filled the colonnades, she would sometimes walk the empty halls alone, not in sorrow, but in sacred solitude. She didn't need to be among the noise to feel joy. She found it in the silence that followed, like the deep breath after a song. When war hovered near, when negotiations frayed, when her sleep was fractured by dreams she could not name, she would sit by the brazier in her chamber and drop myrrh into the flame. The scent, earthy, ancient, would fill the air. She would close her eyes and simply listen to the fire, to her heartbeat, to the world just as it was, not as it demanded to be. Some of her staff called these rituals odd, others sacred. None dared interrupt. She once told a young servant who asked why she sat alone so often, "To lead is to speak often, but to know what matters, I must also learn to hear. And to hear, I must be quiet." Sometimes peace came in. Motion. A slow walk through the lemon grove. The deliberate folding of a linen robe. The simple act of slicing a fig and tasting it with full attention. No courtly flair. No declarations. In stillness, Cleopatra rediscovered the rhythm of her breath, the beat that had been there before power. the pulse that would remain after it. She knew the world saw her as fire strategist, seductress, sovereign. But inside, she kept a garden of quiet, and it was there that she watered the roots of everything she gave to the world. Not every act of leadership roared. Some whispered dot, and some, like Cleopatra's stillness, simply waited until the time came to bloom. Again, the halls of Cleopatra's palace were filled with statues, busts, and mosaic saw curated to immortalize a queen as the world wished to see her. Regal, commanding, divine. But Cleopatra knew that truth could not be carved in stone dot, so she turned to another art, painting. Few were permitted to portray her in this way. The artists she chose were not court decorators or imperial stylists. They were wanderers, thinkers, souls who painted not for praise, but for presence. Those whose hands trembled with the weight of what it meant to truly see someone. The first was an old Greek painter with failing eyesight. He had arrived at court to decorate a guest chamber. But Cleopatra noticed the sketches he made in the margins of his work quick, raw, alive. She summoned him, gave him a private chamber, no time limit, and only one request. Paint what you feel, not what you're told. He painted her as no one ever had, not with a crown, not posed beside a lion or beneath a canopy, but seated on the floor, back slightly curled, one hand resting on a scroll, the other touching the hem of her robe. Her gaze was not regal. It was wondering, remembering, entirely human. When she saw it, Cleopatra did not speak. She simply nodded and had the painting placed where only she would see it in a small alcove behind her music room. Other artists followed. One from Kush, who used pigments mixed with crushed rose petals. Another from the Syrian coast, who painted in near darkness, relying on touch and memory. Each one captured a different version of her, not the myth, but the mosaic of moods, moments, and mysteries that composed her. She posed in silence, never instructing, never correcting. She let them discover her layer by layer dot in one portrait. She is laughing head thrown back, hair loose, eyes wild with joy. In another, she sits beside a broken vase, expression unreadable. And in yet another, only her hands are shown, one clutching a letter, the other open, waiting dot she once wrote. Words can be twisted, statues broken, but a brush dipped in truth leaves its mark beyond time. The portraits were not displayed in public galleries. They were kept in a hidden corridor, lined in velvet and quiet light. A sacred place. A place of memory. Sometimes, when the burden of expectation grew too heavy, Cleopatra would walk this hall alone. Each image greeted her like an old friend. Not the queen, not the symbol, but the woman beneath. She saw her younger self wide-eyed, defiant, unsure. She saw the tired lines that had crept around her eyes. She saw the spark that power could never fully claim. These portraits held her contradictions, her grief, her laughter, her weariness, her moments of madness and mercy. They were not propaganda. They were prayers. When foreign rulers sent their sculptors to render her in marble, she welcomed them. But deep down, she knew those statues would outlast their truth. They would capture only the surface, but the painter's brush, it reached deeper into the soul. She imagined, long after her death, someone stumbling into that corridor, not a scholar, not a conqueror, but perhaps a child, and seeing not just a queen, but a woman who lived, loved, questioned, and tried. And perhaps that would be enough, Dot, because in the end, Cleopatra did not want to be remembered only in gold. She wanted to be remembered in BRUSHSTROK, Dot, in the softness of color, Dot, in the honesty of light, Dot, and in the quiet truth of being seen, not as legend, but as self. Asterisk beyond the grand garden known to visiting dignitaries, where marble statues watched over trimmed hedges and peacocks strutted beneath the fig trees. There lay another space, a hidden garden, Dot. It was not marked on any map, nor mentioned in any court record. It grew quietly behind a cluster of sandstone walls near the palace's southern wing. It was not vast, nor perfectly arranged, but it was hers. Cleopatra tended it with her own hands. She had found the plot years ago, overgrown and forgotten, when the palace was still unfamiliar and her crown still heavy with doubt. Something about the neglect drew her, the vines spilling freely, the wild lavender refusing to be trimmed. It was a space that dared to bloom without approval, Dot, and so she nurtured it, not as a ruler imposing order, but as a woman listening. She did not command the plants to grow. They simply did, in their own way, in their own rhythm. She cleared stones, loosened soil, planted seeds with no record of names. Whatever grew. Dot. It became a place of ritual. Dawn. She visited barefoot. Cool dew kissed her feet. She would whisper greetings to the new buds, brush her fingers along the ferns, hum softly to the bees. The air there was different, more honest. Some days she spoke her thoughts aloud, not proclamations, not strategy, just feelings, the kind that had no place in marble halls. The garden received them all, with wind, with fragrance, with silence. Jasmine grew there, naturally. So did poppies, night-blooming cereus, desert lilies. Some flowers opened only under moonlight. Others released their scent when touched gently. It was a space of soft rebellion, of life that refused to follow the schedule of court. She never brought advisors, rarely even attendants. Only one person besides herself was permitted inside, Madet, her confidant. Even then, only on rare occasions, and always in silence. Cleopatra once wrote, "I wear a crown to rule. I plant flowers to remember why." The garden was where she buried small things, a locket from her mother, a broken reed pipe from childhood, notes she no longer needed to carry. Each planting was both farewell and beginning. When love came and went, she placed petals in the soil. When fear clutched her, she scattered seeds in its place. When joy overwhelmed her, she sat in the center of the garden, arms open, and let it rise like heat from the earth. There were no walls high enough to block sorrow, but the garden taught her how to soften it, not with denial, but with life. With growth. She used the herbs she grew: thyme, marjoram, mint, not just in ointments and infusions, but in daily rituals. A tea to calm a sleepless night, a balm for tired temples, a scent pressed into her wrists before battle or birth. No one in the empire knew where her calm came from. They assumed it was innate, but Cleopatra knew it came from the soil, from the green things that thrived in secret. In the final seasons of her life, the garden grew wilder. She let it. It had earned its right to grow without pruning, just as she had. And when the time came, when whispers turned to rumors and peace turned to war, she did not run to the throne room. She went to the garden. There, beneath a canopy of vines and stars, she sat with her fingers in the earth and smiled, because in that moment she was not legend. Not monarch Dot, she was simply Cleopatra. And her garden, still blooming in silence, would remember her always. Asterisk long before the palaces were raised and the cities bore her name, there was the C. Cleopatra never forgot that, even at the height of her reign, when her name echoed through corridors and her image traveled on minted coins. She sought the shore, not the busy docks where trade and tribute bustled under the watch of soldiers, but a quieter stretch just beyond the last fisherman's hut, where the sand met the water without expectation. It was where her footsteps faded quickly, where each trace she left was kissed away by the tide. She came without entourage, without sandals, without ceremony, just a simple cloak and silence. The sand was warm, even at dusk. It stuck to her feet, reminded her of her body, real, rooted, touchable. Here, she was not a symbol. She was skin, breath, memory. The sea recognized her not as queen, but as daughter. She walked slowly, always in the same direction, as if following something ancient. The wind played with her hair, tangled it, freed it. Sometimes she spoke aloud to the waves, to the horizon, to the sky. No one answered. And that was the point. The shore held no judgment. It did not demand she be wise or beautiful or strong. It asked only that she be. There were nights when she wept, not from weakness, but from holding too much. The sea did not flinch. It took her tears as it took the rain, without question, without pause. Other times she laughed, sudden and loud, like a child startled by a crab skittering across her path, or the cold splash of a wave catching her off guard. In those moments, she felt time loosen. She collected shells, smooth stones, pieces of driftwood. She kept them in a small clay bowl in her private chamber, not for display, for remembrance. Once, she found a seal pup washed ashore. It breathed, barely. She stayed with it for hours, singing softly, stroking its wet fur until the tide coaxed it back to life. It blinked once at her and disappeared into the deep. She watched until it became shadow. That night, she wrote in her journal, "Today, I touched something that asked for nothing, and in return gave me peace." When Rome pressed closer, when alliances twisted like ropes ready to snap, Cleopatra returned to the shore more frequently, not for escape, but for equilibrium. The tide reminded her that empires were not eternal, but rhythm was. The sea, like power, rose and fell. But unlike power, it asked no loyalty. She never stayed long, just enough. Long enough for the salt to settle on her skin, for her breath to match the pulse of the waves, for her shadow to stretch, then fade into the twilight. No one ever followed her there, and had they tried, she might have vanished into the mist, because this stretch of sand was hers, not in title, but in spirit. Her sanctuary beyond marble, beyond myth. And though her footprints always disappeared, she knew the shore would remember. Not in stone, but in rhythm. In scent. In the soft hush of waves over sand. Where Cleopatra, once and again, walked. And was simply herself. Asterisk. Beneath Cleopatra's bed, behind a carved cedar panel few servants even knew could open, lay a flat box wrapped in linen. It was not locked. It did not need to be. No one else was meant to see what it held. Inside were her journals, scrolls folded, parchments, scraps of papyrus pressed between silk. Some bore no dates, Some had water stains. A few were burned at the edges. But each page carried a voice. Not as queen, not as strategist, not as myth, but as woman. She began writing as a girl, when the palace was still too large, and her questions too many. At first, it was mimicry, copying the letters of philosophers, imitating the poems of temple singers. But soon, the words became hers. Private, true. No titles, no audience, just ink and honesty. Her journals were not a chronicle of power. They were a sanctuary of feeling, of moments unspoken, of thoughts she dared not share, even with her confidant. Some entries were long filled with longing, with questions, with rage. Others were a single line. Today, I wished I were not known. Or, the jasmine bloomed early. I needed that. In these pages, she confessed to love, not always named. Sometimes just the outline of a presence, a gaze, a voice that lingered after the conversation ended. She recorded dreams of flying above the desert, of sailing to lands with blue trees and no language, of becoming small again, of becoming air. She wrote about her body, the curve of her spine. After hours at court, the ache in her feet, the warmth of sun on her back during garden walks. She wrote not for vanity, but for grounding. A reminder that she lived within skin, not statues. She wrote about fear. I am afraid that my people see strength and not the sorrow beneath it. And about faith. I do not know if Isis hears me, but I speak anyway. That must be enough. There were angry pages, torn ones, sentences scratched out until they bled. Frustrations with Rome, with betrayal, with the limitations of diplomacy. But even in rage, her pen moved with purpose. These journals were where she returned to herself. On quiet nights, she unwrapped them like relics. She'd read old entries aloud, softly, letting past versions of herself echo back. Sometimes she wept. Sometimes she laughed at her younger worries. But always, she listened up. No historian would ever read these pages. No scholar would cite them. And that pleased her. Because here, she was not Cleopatra, the seventh of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was a woman trying to hold on to pieces of her truth before. The world demanded she forget. She once wrote, "If history will not let me be whole, let these pages remember the parts I could not say aloud." In the final years, she wrote more frequently. Shorter entries, tighter script, but always with care. She folded each page as if tucking a secret into a lover's hand. And when storms gathered, when Rome crept closer, when whispers of betrayal filled the halls, she did not rush to her generals. She opened her journal. She wrote, "I will endure," but not because they expect it, because I choose to, and folded it away. In solitude, on paper. She was not preparing to be remembered. She was remembering herself. Asterisk, there were moments small, fleeting, almost invisible, when Cleopatra reclaimed herself through the simplest of pleasures. Like the taste of honey. She kept a small jar of it, sealed in clay, on a shelf near her writing desk. Not imported from the distant lands of the empire, but local, harvested from the quiet hives near the palace's southern edge, where bees worked undisturbed, among lavender and acacia. She did not eat it every day. It was not part of courtly banquets or feasts laid for foreign dignitaries. No, honey was for her alone. A ritual, a pause. After long councils, when her voice had turned hoarse from decisions and negotiations, she would retreat to her chamber. There, With the light dim and the air cooled by drawn curtains, she would open the jar. She never used a spoon. She dipped her finger in, slow and deliberate, and brought the golden sweetness to her lips like a prayer. A moment that asked for nothing, but presence. In those seconds, there were no maps to redraw, no rumors to untangle, no kingdoms to balance on her spine. Only the honey and the quiet. Its flavor carried more than sweetness. It carried sun, flowers, time, the labor of insects who never asked for crowns. Cleopatra once wrote, "This is what joy tastes like when no one is watching." There were other pleasures, equally small. A sip of cold water after a bath, the rough texture of linen drying in the sun, a breeze that slipped through the curtains and moved her hair with no agenda. But honey, that stayed with her. Sometimes she shared it. Once, with a young servant girl who had cut her hand tending the citrus trees. Cleopatra dabbed a drop of honey onto the wound, then another onto the girl's tongue. The girl smiled. That memory remained. Another time, with a guest from a far kingdom, anxious and far from home, Cleopatra offered no speeches, no diplomacy, only a piece of flatbread folded with honey, warm from the fire. The guest later wrote, "I met a queen who offered me gold, and it melted on my tongue. But mostly, she kept the sweetness to herself." It reminded her that power did not always need to be displayed, that not all gifts were meant for the treasury. Some were for the spirit, and the spirit, she knew, could starve long before the body. There were days she fasted, not from food, but from noise. She would sit in her chamber, window open, and eat nothing but a fig, or a fig dipped in honey. The taste lingered on her lips as she wrote, thought, simply breathed. She recalled her mother once saying that bees taught the gods how to love in stillness, that each drop of honey held a secret known only to the flowers. Cleopatra believed it. And as Rome pressed closer, as alliances frayed, as her legacy began to take shape not in the present, but in the imaginations of others, she held to this one truth, that joy, real joy, could not be performed. It had to be tasted and remembered. When the honey jar was nearly empty, she didn't rush to refill it. She waited. Let the absence make its own space. Let the memory of sweetness stretch, because even that emptiness had its flavor. And in a world of power, performance, and politics, Cleopatra knew this. Sometimes, the most radical thing a queen could do was sit still and taste the honey. Long before she commanded ships or counseled with generals, Cleopatra dreamed of the desert, not the desert of maps or campaigns, not the dry stretch between oases marked by strategists, but the desert of myth, the desert of silence, the one that lived in the quiet space behind her thoughts. Began in childhood, when she would sneak away from her tutors to lie in the sun, watching birds spiral above the dunes. The warmth on her skin, the slow movement of clouds, it made her feel as though the earth was breathing with her. As she grew, the dreams returned more vividly. At night, she would walk barefoot across a sea of sand in her sleep. No court, number, crown, just her, a sky full of stars, and an endless horizon. Sometimes, the dreams began with a single hawk circling above her. Other times, with a fig tree growing impossibly in the middle of the dunes, bearing fruit she never picked. And once, a vision so clear it startled her awake. A caravan of women dressed in indigo, singing in a language she'd never heard, but somehow understood. she began recording these dreams. Not in her formal scrolls, but in small fragments tucked into her journals. The sand knows my name. I walked for hours and felt lighter with each step. The desert did not ask who I was. It only asked if I was listening. These were not dreams of escape. They were dreams of return. In her waking life, she sought to understand them. She asked desert priests. She read texts from the Siwa oasis. She learned of prophets who wandered into the sands and came back changed. Once, in disguise, she journeyed for days beyond the city walls, toward the dry lands where nothing bloomed. There, beneath the crimson sun, she stood atop a dune and felt the wind wrap around her body like fabric. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I am not here to rule. I am here to remember." A snake slithered past her feet. She did not move. That night, she slept under the open sky with only the stars for company. And for the first time in years, she did not dream. She simply rested, as if the desert had absorbed the need to speak. Back in Alexandria, she carried grains of sand in a small pouch tied to her belt. When overwhelmed, she'd open it and let a few fall into her palm. That texture, ancient, shapeless, brought her back to stillness. The desert reminded her that form was temporary, that titles, wars, palaces, none of them could endure as long as the sand beneath them. In her most private rituals, she would draw patterns in trays of fine desert dust, spirals, waves, symbols that came to her unbidden. When finished, she'd smooth the surface clean again. She once told her confidant, "If I ever disappear, look to the dunes. That is where I will return." Some nights, when sleep refused her, she would light incense of frankincense and myrrh, close her eyes, and invite the desert back. It always came, in silence, in vision, in breath. In those dreams, she did not wear a crown. She wore linen. Her hair was loose. Her hands were empty, but her soul was full. And the sand, ever ancient, held her footsteps like it remembered them from another life. Perhaps it did, because some spirits are not born in cities. They are born in winds. In sun. In the Eve. Dreams of the desert. Where Cleopatra always found her truest self waiting, barefoot, beneath the stars. War did not begin with the clash of swords. Not for Cleopatra. It began with silence. A stillness so deep it vibrated under her skin. Before every storm, political or literal, there came a moment when the world seemed to pause, inhale, and hold its breath. That was when Cleopatra was most alert. She knew how to read the quiet, a missed glance between generals, a gap in a scroll's usual phrasing, the arrival of pigeons with no reply tied to their legs, rumors on lips that smiled too wide, the wind shifting slightly in the garden. Cleopatra understood that storms did not come uninvited. They gathered long before they showed their teeth. She had a ritual for these moments. She would sit alone in the room behind her chambers, the one with a single oil lamp and nothing on the walls. The stone there stayed cool, no matter the season. She'd bring no scrolls, no counsel, only herself, and listen. She did not fear conflict, but she respected it. In that room, she would speak aloud, not to prepare speeches or commands, but to hear her own voice outside of echo chambers. She'd name her fears, her hopes, her uncertainties. To name them was to soften their edge. Afterward, she would bathe not for vanity, but for purification. She'd rub salt and crushed mint into her skin, letting tension leave with every rinse. Then she'd braid her hair, slow and deliberate, as if weaving strength into each strand. Before meetings, she burned desert sage. Not for show, but to clear the air. She dressed simply on these days, not in gold, but in linen. Not to diminish her power, but to return to its source. She knew that before any battle, internal balance must come first. On one such morning, before addressing the court with news of a broken alliance, she sat in her garden for hours. Bees moved among the basil. A crow called in the distance. She watched ants carry petals into their underground world. Life did not pause for politics. When she rose, she whispered, "Let me speak from stillness, not fear." And she did. Not all storms came with ships. Some came with ink and broken promises. When Rome stirred, when names once allied grew cold, she returned to the sea wall. There, facing the open water, she would recite the names of her ancestors aloud, each one a beat in her heart. Cleopatra was not rash. She planned like a weaver, each thread of strategy crossing another: military, diplomatic, emotional. She sent letters where needed. She met spies in corridors, never raising her voice, because storms feared those who did not flinch. On the night before her ships were to sail, she visited her musicians. No grand performance, just a single harp, a slow melody, and her eyes closed. When asked why, she said, "The soul must be steady, or the command will shatter." She wrote letters that would never be sent: farewells, confessions, prayers, each one sealed and placed beneath her pillow. Not for the world, for herself. And when dawn arrived, when sandals echoed on palace floors and armor clinked with urgency, Cleopatra walked calmly through it all, because she had already met the storm. In silence, and made peace with it. So when the first arrow flew, or the first insult landed, she did not shake. She had anchored herself hours before. In breath. In ritual. In the calm that comes only when one understands that storms pass, but the soul, grounded and clear, endures. Asterisk. In the deepest corridors of her memory, Cleopatra kept a room lit by laughter. It was not large nor ornate, but it was filled with the warmth of her earliest days, before crowns, before Rome, before the weight of legacy. When her world was smaller and her laughter unmeasured, she remembered running barefoot through sun-warmed corridors, her arms outstretched like wings. Her sister close behind, their shrieks echoing like birdsong through the marble halls. They chased each other between pillars, slipped unpolished floors, and collapsed in giggles, breathless, tangled in linen and joy. There were hiding places only she knew, beneath a draped statue, behind the largest urn in the hallway. She would crouch there, holding her breath, heart pounding, convinced she was invisible. When found, the shriek of surprise would end in a fit of laughter that shook her whole frame. In the gardens, she played with cats, who seemed to know she wasn't queen yet. They purred and pounced, their games just as serious as hers. One of them, pale with one blue eye, followed her everywhere. She named him Nesu, the Whisper, her mother's. Hands braided her hair with hibiscus flowers, humming songs passed down from grandmothers. Cleopatra sang them long after her mother was gone, the melody sometimes spilling from her lips without her knowing. It always softened her shoulders. There were evenings spent by the kitchen hearth, where cooks slipped her sweets and told stories too strange for court. She listened wide-eyed to tales of desert spirits and river gods. of talking crocodiles and dancing stars. She remembered the scent of citrus in summer, the tart juice running down her chin as she bit into fruit still warm from the sun. The way her father once lifted her high above his head, declaring, "One day the stars will bow to you." She didn't understand, but the sky did seem closer from up there. She kept these memories not as nostalgia, but as medicine. In moments of doubt, she would close her eyes and walk the old corridors of her mind. There, in that hidden room, she heard the laughter again. Not polished, not diplomatic, but wild, pure. She once told her confidant, "I lead a kingdom, but my childhood leads me. It reminds me I was not always burdened. I was once only breath and laughter." She rarely spoke of those early days to others, not because she feared losing power, but because some memories are too sacred to share widely. They are worn smooth from revisiting, whispered only to the heart. One scroll she kept held only a list: stone hallway, fig tree, Neshu, mother's song, orange sunrise, laughter in the bath, fireflies, aunt's perfume, bread still warm, my sister's giggle. No explanation, just anchors. In later years, when the world pressed harder, she made it a ritual. After sunset, with the city quieted, she'd light a single candle and sit in silence, allowing the echoes to come. Sometimes she'd smile. Other times she'd whisper, "Thank you," to no one visible. Because laughter, she knew, was not just an echo. It was a compass. And it led her back to the truest version of herself, the girl before the throne, before the war, before the myth. Just Cleopatra. Running, breathless, toward nothing but the joy of being. Asterisk. Cleopatra's defiance rarely looked like rebellion. It was not always forged in declarations or battles. More often, it was a gesture, a glance, a choice so subtle it slipped past notice. But beneath the silence, she moved like a tide unseen until it changed everything. She learned early that power did not always come with volume, that the most radical thing a woman in her position could do was remain fully herself in a world that demanded performance. So she chose her rebellions with care. She wore linen on days the court expected gold. She answered envoys in their native tongues, refusing to let male translators shape her intent. She chose to walk alone when appearances demanded she be carried. These were not grand revolts, but quiet refusals to be shaped by expectation. In a palace where every gesture was scripted, each act of authenticity became an act of resistance. She read her own correspondence. She kept advisors waiting. She took her meals late, not to inconvenience, but to remind those around her that time belonged first to herself. Once, during a heated council, an elder senator dismissed her words with a wave of his hand. Cleopatra said nothing. Instead, she stood, poured him a glass of water, and waited in silence as he drank it. He did not interrupt her again. When Rome demanded tribute, she sent books. When generals expected feasts, she offered poetry. And when foreign rulers came to assert dominance, she invited them to walk her gardens barefoot. It disarmed them. It reminded them that thrones are not always made of stone, that power can bloom, soft and unyielding, among jasmine. In the temple, she insisted on lighting her own incense. In private, she stitched her own cloak. In council, she often paused longer than necessary before speaking, making others lean in, listen harder, second-guess their assumptions. She once refused to hold court for 3 days after a beloved servant was exiled by a political rival. No decree, no outburst, just silence. It rippled louder than any protest. Her staff came to understand that when she wore her hair unadorned, change was near. When she hummed softly during a council meeting, decisions had already been made. She trained her cats to ignore commands, just to prove that even in the palace, not all things bowed. She wrote letters and burned them before sealing. She painted her eyelids with crushed lotus, not to allure, but to remember her mother. She dared to laugh too loud at a philosopher's joke in a room full of men who never expected her to understand. These rebellions did not start wars. They changed the air. In rooms, they shifted the rhythm of power. They reminded those around her that sovereignty begins in the self. And though history may forget these moments, the spoon left untouched, walk taken alone, the smile offered when a frown was expected, Cleopatra did not. She once wrote, "I will not shout, I will not storm. I will bloom where I am told to wither." And she did in every chamber, in every breath. A queen, not only of land, but of presence. A rebel, not in battle, but in being fully, unapologetically herself. It was not written for the court, not for her heirs, not for any historian. It was written in the quiet before sunrise, by a woman who ruled an empire, but longed in secret for someone to speak gently to her heart. Cleopatra wrote the letter on parchment smoother than any she used for decrees. She sharpened her reed pen with care, mixed the ink herself, and lit a single lamp. Outside, the city still slept. Inside, something stirred. She began with no title, no salutation, just the first line. You are not failing. The words sat heavy, then softened. She breathed deeply and continued. You are tired, yes, but that is not weakness. That is proof that you are still moving, even when the path is dust and echo. She paused. Listen to the crackle of the lamp. Your strength is not in the speeches or the scrolls. It is in the way you wake, again and again, when the world offers you every reason to vanish. She wrote slowly, letting each word arrive without force. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to doubt. You are allowed to long for figs warm from the sun, for laughter with no calculation, for footsteps that lead nowhere but peace. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the relief of being unguarded. You have given so much. Let this letter give back. Let it be a soft place to fall. Let it remind you of the girl who walked beside the Nile, who listened to reeds sing, who believed in the quiet magic of her breath. She did not cry. The tears had already been shed in gardens, on balconies, in the folds of pillowcases never witnessed by court. Instead, she smiled soft, tired, real. There will be days when they do not understand you. Love them anyway. There will be nights when even the stars feel too far. Look inward. You carry galaxies in your spirit. She folded the parchment in thirds. You are not alone. You never were. She sealed it with wax, marked it with no insignia, just a small curve like the beginning of a smile. Then she tucked it beneath her pillow. She never spoke of it. But when nights stretched long, when eyes grew cold, when memory felt more real than presence, she would slip her hand beneath the linen, touch the paper's edge, and remember. She had written herself back into wholeness. A queen, yes, but also a woman who dared to whisper hope into her own silence. Asterisk, there was a time of night that belonged only to her Dot after the court had quieted, after the guards exchanged nods in shadowed halls, after the lamps had dimmed and the breeze grew still. Dot, it was the hour of the moon. Dot Cleopatra would slip from her chamber, barefoot, wrapped in a dark linen shawl, and climb the narrow stone steps to the highest terrace of the palace. No attendants, no record, no crown, just a woman, the night, and the sky. There, beneath the slow turning of stars, she let the weight fall away. The moon knew her secrets. It had watched her since childhood, splashing in river water, whispering to fig trees, growing into power not by command, but by necessity. It never judged, never asked, only listened. Dot, so she spoke, not aloud, not always. Sometimes just with breath, with silence, with the soft movement of her hands through the cool air, and sometimes with words fragmented, honest, unpolished. "Tired tonight," she'd say. Or, "They think strength has no cost." Or simply, "Do you see me still?" She brought nothing with her. No scrolls, no plans, only herself. And in that simplicity, she found reflection. The moon cast silver light across the marble, turning her shadow into something almost sacred. It followed her as she paced slowly, or sat still, legs tucked beneath her, arms wrapped around knees. Sometimes she hummed, a tune from her childhood, a lullaby she never fully forgot. A sound barely left her lips, but it filled the space between thoughts. She thought about her choices, the ones she was praised for, the ones she questioned. Dot, she thought about the people she had loved, and those who had loved her more for her legend than her soul. She thought about moments of joy so pure they frightened her, and about the fear that joy could not last. The moon did not answer, but its silence made room. Dot, she once wrote, "At midnight, I remember I am not only ruler, I am rhythm, I am breath. I am the child who still watches shadows move across stone." Some nights she stayed for minutes, others until the first light of dawn began to pull color back into the sky. She would leave no trace, only a faint warmth on the stone where she sat. Dot, and in the moonlight, she found not solutions, but stillness, not answers, but acceptance, a rhythm to match her own heart, a presence that asked for nothing, yet gave everything. Dot, so she returned, night after night. Dot, because in the hour of the moon, Cleopatra was not history. Dot, she was reflection. Dot, soft, infinite. Dot, alive. Dot, asterisk before language, before diplomacy, before her name was etched into scrolls and stone. There was the river. Dot, the Nile was her first confidant. Long before Cleopatra understood politics or prophecy, she had stood on its banks as a child, barefoot, with reeds brushing her knees. Water moved slowly, deliberately, whispering stories not meant for history books, but for those who listened with their skin. She did. Even after the palace consumed her days, she returned to the river in her mind. Its rhythm was older than kings. It did not ask for anything. It simply was. And in that constancy, she found home. On rare afternoons, when the court allowed her breath, she would walk down to the quieter bends far from the bustling quays and merchant docks. There, the water took on a softer voice, lapping gently against the shore, murmuring secrets only she seemed to hear. She believed the Nile remembered, not just floods and fish and trade, but the people, the hands that cupped its water, the prayers whispered to it, the blood and the blessings. It carried them all. Cleopatra would sit for hours on a warm rock beneath the shade of sycamores. No guards, no fanfare, just her and the water. She dipped her fingers in and let the current pull slightly, as if inviting her to let go. She once wrote, "The river sings, and I forget the sound of power." Some days she brought fruit or bread. She ate slowly, watching reflections ripple and dissolve. The river taught her about impermanence, that no moment stayed, and yet nothing was truly lost. When lovers left, when friends betrayed, when empires shifted their gaze, the Nile remained. It had cradled her ancestors. It would carry the whispers of her name long after her final breath. She did not try to understand it. She simply trusted it. During droughts, she would walk along its cracked edges and speak softly, as if coaxing it back to fullness. During floods, she'd watch from her terrace as it reached eagerly for the land, life blooming in its wake. It gave, it took, it returned, just as she did. She once asked a priest, "Why do they call the river a god?" He replied, "Because it listens when no one else does." In the final years, when choices narrowed and the walls of history began to close, she found herself at its edge more often, kneeling, watching, whispering, not commands, not confessions, just presence. She placed a small boat in the water once, fashioned from papyrus, a single flower inside. It floated for a moment, then tipped gently, disappearing into the current. She smiled. Not everything needed to be held. Some things needed only to be released. The Nile never answered her, but she never needed it to. Its song was not made of words. It was movement. Memory. Flow. And in that song, Cleopatra heard the only truth that ever mattered. She was part of something vast, eternal, and free. And that even more than the crown was her truest belonging. Asterisk. There were days when Cleopatra wished she could vanish. Not in death, not in defeat, just disappear. Step out of the frame. Slip between moments. Return to a version of herself that didn't need to hold everything together. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't fear. It was the quiet ache of too much visibility. To be seen so constantly, so completely, that her edges blurred. To be everything to everyone, ruler, symbol, legend, and yet feel unknown within her own skin. So she practiced the art of letting go. In ways no one noticed. A ring left behind on her writing table. A decision handed to an advisor without her imprint. A meal skipped, not from appetite, but to leave space. A story she chose not to correct. She let silence her in her place. Sometimes she slipped away from the palace altogether. Disguised, always alone, she wandered markets like a shadow. Listened to how people spoke of her when they didn't know she was near. Not to be praised, just to remember. Other times, she let go of ritual, skipped the incense, left her hair unbraided, or no oils. Not to make a statement, but to breathe. She once wrote, "Some days, I do not want to be a flame. I want to be the space between sparks." In the garden, she let weeds grow. In her journals, she left pages blank. She stared at the sky without seeking omens. She lay on stone floors, cheek to the coolness, letting the heat of her thoughts dissolve. Letting go, she discovered, wasn't surrender. It was release. It was choosing softness in a world that demanded hardness. It was admitting that she did not always have the answers, that she was allowed to be unfinished, unguarded, unknown. There were days when she imagined sailing beyond the horizon. No crown, no name, just wind and water and a body, rediscovering itself, not to run, but to return. She dreamed of being a song sung by no one, a breeze, a ripple in the Nile, something felt, but not held. She knew she would always come back to the throne, to the task, to the people. But for a breath, a blink, a heartbeat, she let herself be something else, And in those invisible moments, Cleopatra remembered, to disappear is not to die, that is to renew, not to let go. And in doing so, to find what was never truly lost, herself. Asterisk, the palace was quieter than usual. Even the birds seemed subdued, their wings cutting the air with a hush that felt like reverence. Servants moved slower, courtiers whispered softer. And in the west, the sun prepared to leave. Cleopatra stood on the balcony that faced the desert, where the sky spread endlessly. She had watched many sunsets from this place, but this one felt different. Not because of fear or regret, but because of clarity. She wore no crown. Her hair, unbound, moved with the warm breeze. The linen at her shoulders fluttered. Her hands rested on the sandstone railing, fingers tracing grooves worn by time and weather. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The moment did not ask for declarations. It asked for presence. The sun dipped lower, casting gold across the city. Alexandria shimmered. The sea beyond flickered like glass. Below, life continued, merchants closing stalls, children laughing in courtyards, priests lighting evening incense. And yet, above it all, she stood still. For years she had carried names: queen, goddess, lover, mother, enemy, savior. But in this final hour, she felt only one Cleopatra, a woman who had loved deeply, who had chosen fiercely, who had held her country with trembling, resolute hands. She thought of her children, their laughter, their questions, their futures unpromised, but still alive in some corner of the world. She closed her eyes briefly and let their memory settle like warmth in her chest. She thought of the garden, the river, the moonlit terrace, the journals folded carefully beneath her bed. All the places where her truest self had lived, not as queen, but as soul. She thought of the myths that would grow like vines over her name, of the historians who would argue dates, motives, lovers. And she smiled not bitterly, but softly, because she knew none of them would truly know her. But this sunset did. It touched her skin gently, as if saying farewell without sorrow. She lifted her chin slightly, inhaling the heat of the dying light. The world turned amber. Her shadow stretched long and regal across the stone. A servant entered, paused at the threshold, and bowed. No words were exchanged, only a glance. The kind that spoke of endings. Cleopatra turned once more to the horizon. I was here, she whispered. Not for legacy, not for remembrance, but to remind the moment and herself that she had lived. Fully. And now, as the sun dipped beneath the dunes and the sky bruised into violet, she stepped back into the room, leaving behind the gold, taking with her only the quiet and the knowing that the last sunset did not mark her fall. It marked her return. To the stillness from which all queens are born. Asterisk history wrote her in ink and marble, but Cleopatra's truest legacy was not chiseled into monuments or confined to the scrolls of victors. It lived in whispers, in the breath between stories, In the pauses where truth and myth touched fingertips, she became many things after. Her final sunset seductress, strategist, sorceress, saint. But behind the portraits and performances, something softer endured. A feeling. A presence. In gardens where jasmine bloomed wild. Her name was still spoken. In the libraries where papyrus rustled under fingers seeking knowledge. Her silence echoed. Not the silence of absence, but of depth. Of layers unrecorded. Women wrote poems under starlight, calling her by names only they understood. Children reenacted her story in sand, with seashell crowns and voices full of wonder. Healers invoked her memory when mixing oils, not for her beauty, but for the rituals she once tended to in solitude. In the hush of morning, when queens stood before their mirrors, they sometimes felt her beside them, not instructing, not judging. Just being. She lived on in every woman who chose stillness over spectacle, in every ruler who understood that listening was stronger than shouting, in every soul who knew that power could bloom softly, like a flower in shadow. She lived on in questions, left unanswered. In journals, never found. In a scent caught on a passing breeze that made someone turn, just for a second, and wonder, was that her? She lived in translations of lullabies once sung to her, now echoing across new lands. In the structure of temples rebuilt after ruin, bearing no name, but shaped by memory. And she lived most clearly in the things that refused to be named. A lingering gaze, a page folded gently, a pause before speaking. Legacy, she had once said, is not what survives. It is what returns, what is felt again. She did not need statues. She had rivers. She did not need tombs. She had dreams. And so Cleopatra, once queen, once child, once myth, continued. Not in power, but in presence. Not in fame, but in feeling. Whispered in gardens. Sung by rivers. Carried in the quiet, where truth always lingers and breathes. Asterisk, the throne was empty. The sandals once placed neatly at its base remained untouched. The courtiers had drifted. The lamps were dimmed. And the great halls no longer echoed with ceremony. But somewhere beyond the palace, beyond the noise of history, Cleopatra walked. Not as queen, not as symbol. As soul. The silence that now surrounded her was not absence, it was arrival. The kind of stillness that only comes after every question has been asked, every role played, every mask laid down. Here, in this space beyond time, she felt light, not weightless, but unburdened. She walked barefoot through a garden that bloomed in moonlight. The air held no heat, no chill, only presence. The scent of fig trees and river reeds followed her, familiar and soft. There were no mirrors, no scrolls, no titles. Only memory, only breath. She passed through rooms made of starlight, each one echoing the moment once lived. Her laughter as a child, the music of her private chamber, the touch of water on her skin during quiet baths, the scratch of her pen against parchment. No one greeted her, and yet she was not alone. The silence welcomed her like an old friend. It did not ask her to explain, to justify, to shine. It only asked that she be. She sat beneath a fig tree. Birds stirred. In its branches, feathers rustling like whispered truths. The earth beneath her was warm. She placed her palms flat against it and closed her eyes. She saw faces, not as history remembered them, but as she remembered them. Her mother's hands, her children's eyes, the smile of a servant girl offering honey on a difficult day, They, man who kissed her forehead before war. They came not to haunt, but to join her. To sit in the quiet together. This was not an afterlife of reward or judgment. It was a return. To self. To source. To peace. She breathed deeply, the same way she had on the banks of the Nile, on balconies kissed by wind, in terraces kissed by moonlight. In the silence, she remembered. And in remembering, she dissolved. Not vanished. Transformed. Into story, into song, into song, into song. The hush between waves. Into the pause before dawn. And so Cleopatra, once empress, once girl, once myth, became what she had always been becoming. A presence in the silence. A light not needing flame. A truth that no history could hold. Only the soul could feel. And only in stillness. Here. Peace. At last. Not found. But remembered.